Jessica Patterson, a 35-year-old resident of Los Angeles, was married to Ron Harris, a 37-year-old factory worker. They had a blended family with Jess's son, Ethan, from her previous marriage. Ethan suffered from cystic fibrosis, a rare genetic disorder that required expensive treatment. Jess had always been very close to her mother. However, after her mother's death, her relationship with her father, James Patterson, became strained. James was a successful businessman and the owner of a real estate company. He was always very strict and demanding. Jess felt that he never truly understood or supported her during difficult times. James's expectations were high, and he often criticized Jess for her choices, both personal and professional. Despite this, Jess admired her father's achievements and aspired to earn his approval. The tension between them only grew as Jess navigated the challenges of being a single mother before marrying Ron. Ron was supportive of Ethan's medical needs, but had his limitations. Working long hours at the factory, he struggled to provide both financially and emotionally. His frustrations sometimes led to arguments with Jess, especially about how to manage their limited resources for Ethan's care. Despite these challenges, Jess believed in their ability to make things work. Ethan's condition required constant medical attention and frequent hospital visits. Jess devoted herself to ensuring that Ethan received the best possible care. This included advocating for him at school, managing his treatments, and finding ways to afford the necessary medications. Her dedication to Ethan's well-being was unwavering, even as it put a strain on her marriage with Ron. The family lived in a modest home in a middle-class neighborhood of Los Angeles. Jess took on various part-time jobs to supplement Ron's income, often working late into the night after caring for Ethan all day. Her resilience was evident to those who knew her, but the constant pressure took its toll. Jess's relationship with her father added another layer of complexity. After her mother's death, James became more critical and less supportive. He frequently expressed his disappointment in Jess's life choices, including her marriage to Ron. Jess felt isolated and misunderstood, but she persevered for Ethan's sake. Despite the strained relationship with her father, Jess continued to seek his approval, hoping that one day he would see her efforts and sacrifices. Ron resented the time and money spent on Ethan's treatment, feeling neglected and secondary in Jess's life. Jess, on the other hand, felt that Ron did not understand the severity of Ethan's condition and the importance of the care he required. Jess's days were filled with a never-ending list of tasks and responsibilities. She juggled work, household chores, and Ethan's medical needs, often neglecting her own well-being. Her health began to suffer, and she experienced frequent bouts of exhaustion and stress-related illnesses. Despite this, she never wavered in her commitment to her son. The relationship with her father remained a source of emotional turmoil for Jess. James continued to express his disappointment in her, criticizing her for not achieving more in her life. Jess longed for his approval and support, but it seemed increasingly out of reach. Jess's support network was limited. She had a few close friends who tried to help, but they could only do so much. Medical bills piled up, and despite her best efforts, Jess found it difficult to make ends meet. She applied for financial aid and sought out charitable organizations to help cover the costs of Ethan's treatment. But the burden remained heavy. Ron, feeling the pressure of their financial situation, took on extra shifts at the factory. The long hours and physical labor took a toll on him, leaving him even less able to provide emotional support to Jess. James Patterson passed away after a long illness, leaving Jess an inheritance of $800,000. Jess was shocked and saddened by her father's death. Upon learning about the inheritance, Ron began to show signs of envy and dissatisfaction. He believed that the money should be used for their mutual benefit, such as buying a new car or paying off debts. Ron's perspective was practical, focusing on immediate improvements to their quality of life. He saw the inheritance as a means to alleviate the financial pressures they had been facing. Jessica, however, was resolute in her decision to use the inheritance for Ethan's treatment. The cost of managing Ethan's cystic fibrosis was overwhelming, and the inheritance provided a rare opportunity to ensure that he received the best possible care without the constant worry of financial strain. The inheritance became a focal point of conflict between Jess and Ron. Ron felt that Jess was being selfish by not considering their joint needs and the future they were building together. He accused her of prioritizing Ethan's needs over their marriage. Jess, on the other hand, was frustrated by Ron's inability to understand the gravity of Ethan's condition and the importance of securing his health. She saw Ron's perspective as short-sighted and self-serving, failing to recognize the life-and-death stakes involved in Ethan's treatment. As the arguments over the inheritance intensified, Jess found herself increasingly isolated. Her relationship with Ron deteriorated, and she felt the weight of the responsibility for Ethan's care more acutely than ever. The financial and emotional strain took a significant toll on her, but she remained steadfast in her decision to prioritize Ethan's needs. Jess's relationship with her father had always been complicated, and his death brought those complexities to the forefront. While she mourned his passing and the unresolved issues between them, she also felt a sense of relief that the inheritance could provide a solution to Ethan's medical needs. This duality of grief and gratitude added to the emotional burden she carried. His frustration and resentment grew as he saw Jess's determination to use the money exclusively for Ethan's treatment. He felt excluded from the decision-making process and believed that Jess was undermining their partnership. This sense of alienation and betrayal fueled his anger and deepened the divide between them. Jess's focus on Ethan's well-being was unwavering, but it came at a cost. The constant arguments with Ron and the stress of managing Ethan's condition left her feeling exhausted and emotionally drained. She began to question the future of her marriage and whether she could continue to rely on Ron for support. Despite the turmoil in her personal life, Jess remained committed to ensuring that Ethan received the best possible care. She sought out specialists and treatment options that could improve his quality of life and give him a fighting chance against his illness. The inheritance provided the financial means to pursue these opportunities, but the cost to her marriage and emotional well-being was significant. As Jess navigated the complexities of her inheritance and the impact on her family, she remained focused on her son's health and future. One day, the ongoing arguments reached a boiling point. Ron, consumed by anger and frustration, exploded in a fit of rage. He accused Jess of always putting her family's interests above their marriage. He shouted that she never considered his feelings or their future together. This accusation cut deeply into Jess, who already felt isolated and unsupported. Feeling humiliated and insulted, Jess shot back with equal intensity. She declared that her priority was her son's well-being and that she would do anything to help him, even if it meant the destruction of their marriage. The room was filled with the echoes of their heated exchange, each word widening the rift between them. The atmosphere in their home had become unbearable. The constant tension and volatility were taking a toll on everyone, including Ethan. Jess noticed how the stress was affecting her son, adding another layer of guilt and frustration to her already overwhelming burden. She felt trapped in a situation where there seemed to be no winning solution. Jess's response to Ron's outburst marked a turning point. She realized that the marriage might be beyond repair. The man she once loved and trusted was now a source of constant pain and conflict. Ron, on the other hand, was spiraling into a state of resentment and bitterness. His feelings of betrayal and inadequacy fueled his anger. He saw Jess's determination to prioritize Ethan's treatment as a direct challenge to his authority and worth as a husband. This perception only intensified his need to assert control and dominance in their relationship. Friends and family began to notice the change in Jess and Ron's relationship. The once united and loving couple now seemed estranged and hostile. Jess confided in a few close friends about the situation, seeking their support and advice. Many of them sympathized with her plight, understanding the difficult position she was in. They offered words of encouragement and practical advice, but the decision ultimately rested with Jess. Ron, however, found little solace in his social circle. His friends were divided on the issue, with some understanding his frustration and others condemning his behavior. The lack of unanimous support only added to his feelings of isolation and anger. He felt misunderstood and vilified, further deepening his resolve to stand his ground. Jess began to seriously consider the possibility of leaving Ron. She questioned whether it was possible to maintain a healthy environment for Ethan while staying in such a toxic marriage. The prospect of starting over was daunting, but the thought of continuing in a relationship filled with animosity was equally unbearable. Ron, sensing Jess's growing detachment, became even more aggressive in his attempts to assert control. He made threats about legal action, claiming that he had a right to the inheritance as her husband. These threats only served to solidify Jess's resolve to protect Ethan and her financial independence. She knew that leaving Ron would be difficult. The escalation of conflict reached its peak when Ron, in a moment of uncontrollable rage, confronted Jess with an ultimatum. He demanded that she choose between him and Ethan's treatment, accusing her of destroying their marriage and future. Jess, her patience and tolerance exhausted, responded with finality. She told Ron that she would always choose her son, and that if he couldn't support that decision, their marriage was over. This declaration marked the end of any hope for reconciliation. Ron's anger turned into a cold, calculating determination to make Jess pay for what he saw as her betrayal. Jess, on the other hand, began making plans to leave, seeking legal advice and support from friends. On the night following yet another explosive argument, Ron, intoxicated and consumed by anger, committed a horrific act. In a fit of uncontrollable rage, he murdered Jess in their home. Ron had been drinking heavily that evening, attempting to drown his frustrations and fears in alcohol. The argument that ensued was more intense than any before. Jess reiterated her unwavering stance on using the inheritance for Ethan's treatment, and Ron, feeling cornered and desperate, lashed out with a ferocity that neither of them could have anticipated. The details of that fateful night were later pieced together through police investigations and witness testimonies. Neighbors reported hearing loud shouting and the sound of breaking glass, followed by a chilling silence. In his drunken state, Ron's actions were erratic and brutal. He attacked Jess with a kitchen knife, inflicting fatal wounds in a moment of blind rage. After realizing what he had done, Ron panicked. The gravity of his actions began to sink in, but his intoxicated mind could not fully comprehend the consequences. Driven by a desperate need to cover up the crime, he attempted to stage the scene to make it look like a burglary gone wrong. He ransacked the house, breaking furniture and scattering belongings to create the illusion of a violent intrusion. Ron took the knife he used to kill Jess and tried to clean it, but bloodstains were still visible. He then hid the weapon in a garbage bag, hoping it would go unnoticed amidst the chaos he had created. He also attempted to change his clothes, disposing of the blood-soaked garments in the same manner. His actions were frantic and disorganized, driven by a mix of fear, guilt, and intoxication. In his disoriented state, Ron even considered fleeing the scene. However, the thought of leaving behind everything he knew, including the inheritance he desperately coveted, kept him from taking that step. Instead, he concocted a story to tell the authorities, hoping to divert suspicion away from himself. Ron called 911, feigning shock and grief as he reported the supposed burglary and Jess's murder. He played the role of the devastated husband, expressing horror at finding his wife dead and their home in disarray. His acting was convincing enough to initially mislead the responding officers, who treated the scene as a potential burglary-turned-homicide. However, the police quickly noticed inconsistencies in Ron's story. Their suspicions were further aroused by the lack of forced entry and the haphazard nature of the staged burglary. Forensic evidence began to reveal the truth. Blood spatter patterns indicated that the attack occurred in a fit of rage, not during a burglary. Moreover, the knife, despite Ron's attempts to clean it, bore clear traces of blood that matched Jess's DNA. Detectives discovered records of the couple's intense arguments and Ron's escalating aggression. Friends and neighbors came forward with accounts of the couple's strained relationship and Ron's growing resentment over the inheritance. The evidence against Ron was mounting, and it became increasingly difficult for him to maintain his innocence. Ron's cell phone records also played a crucial role in unraveling the truth. Text messages and calls between him and a close friend revealed his growing frustration with Jess and his fixation on the inheritance. In one particularly damning message, sent just days before the murder, Ron expressed a desire to get rid of Jess and use the money for himself. Faced with overwhelming evidence, Ron's defense crumbled. He was arrested and charged with the murder of Jess. During the trial, the prosecution presented a compelling case, detailing the events leading up to the tragic night and the irrefutable forensic evidence. The jury heard from expert witnesses who explained the blood spatter analysis and the psychological profile of Ron, painting a picture of a man driven to extreme violence by his own insecurities and greed. Ron attempted to defend his actions by claiming he acted in a moment of temporary insanity. brought on by the stress of their ongoing conflicts and his intoxicated state. However, the jury was unmoved by his arguments. The premeditated nature of his actions, the attempt to stage the scene, and the clear motive of financial gain all pointed to a calculated and deliberate act of murder. Ron's defense team struggled to counter the overwhelming evidence. They attempted to argue that Ron's actions were the result of extreme emotional stress and intoxication, leading to a temporary loss of control. However, the prosecution refuted these claims by demonstrating the calculated nature of Ron's actions after the murder. His attempts to stage the scene and hide evidence showed a clear consciousness of guilt. Throughout the trial, the emotional toll on Jess's family and friends was palpable. They listened in anguish as the details of her brutal murder were recounted in the courtroom. Ethan, Jess's son, was particularly affected, having lost his mother in such a violent and senseless manner. The courtroom atmosphere was heavy with grief and anger as the jury listened to the harrowing testimony and examined the evidence. In the end, the jury was unanimous in their verdict. Ron was found guilty of first-degree murder. The judge, recognizing the premeditated and heinous nature of the crime, sentenced Ron to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was to serve his sentence at San Quentin State Prison in California. The sentencing brought a sense of closure to Jess's loved ones, although the pain of their loss remained. They took some solace in knowing that justice had been served and that Ron would be held accountable for his actions. Ron's incarceration at San Quentin marked the end of a dark chapter. The prison, known for housing some of the state's most dangerous offenders, would be Ron's home for the rest of his life. There, he would have ample time to reflect on the choices he made and the life he destroyed in his quest for control and financial gain. Casper Peterson, the head of the family, lives with his wife, Laura, and their daughter, Kayla. Casper was born in 1975 in a small town in the USA. He grew up in an ordinary family and was always known to be kind and considerate. His parents, both school teachers, instilled in him a strong sense of responsibility and work ethic. After finishing high school, Casper enrolled in a university where he studied business and economics. Upon graduating from university, he began working for a large company, quickly advancing in his career to become one of the executives. His colleagues admired his dedication and strategic mind, which helped the company thrive under his influence. Laura Peterson, Casper's wife, was born in 1978 in the same town where Casper was born. She grew up in a lively household with 2 brothers and 2 sisters. Laura was always very sociable and cheerful, traits that made her popular among her peers. Her parents ran a small local business, which taught her the importance of community and empathy from an early age. After finishing high school, Laura went to university to study psychology. She was fascinated by the human mind and wanted to help people overcome their struggles. After completing her degree, she started working as a psychologist at a local school. Her warm personality and insightful advice made her a beloved figure among students and staff alike. Their daughter, Kayla Peterson, was born in 2000. She grew up in a nurturing and supportive environment, surrounded by love and encouragement. Kayla was always kind and empathetic, traits that made her many friends throughout her childhood. From a young age, she showed a keen interest in art. After finishing high school, Kayla began studying art at university. She has always been a talented artist and dreams of becoming a famous painter. Her professors and peers often commend her unique style and emotional depth in her work, seeing great potential in her future career. Zoe Miller, Kayla's best friend, was born in 2002. She grew up in a family with 2 brothers and sisters, and was always very outgoing and lively. Her family moved to the town when she was 10, and she quickly became friends with Kayla. The two were inseparable, sharing dreams and supporting each other through thick and thin. After finishing high school, Zoe went to university to study business. She has always been very ambitious and dreams of becoming a successful businesswoman. Zoe's parents owned a small chain of stores, and she grew up watching them manage and expand their business. This inspired her to pursue a career in business, and she has shown a knack for leadership and innovation in her studies. Casper, Laura, Kayla, and Zoe have always been very close and supportive of each other. They often spent weekends together, enjoying family outings and shared meals. However, recently, Casper has started to feel lonely and unhappy in his marriage. Despite Laura's efforts to connect with him, he feels a growing distance between them. He feels that Laura does not understand him and that he cannot communicate with her effectively. As Casper's dissatisfaction grows, he begins to seek comfort elsewhere. He finds himself drawn to Zoe, Kayla's best friend, who often visits their home. Zoe's youthful energy and ambition remind him of his own younger self. They start having long conversations about life and aspirations, and Casper feels a connection with her that he hasn't felt in years. This connection slowly develops into a secret relationship, filled with both excitement and guilt. Casper is torn between the thrill of his new relationship and the guilt of betraying his family. He rationalizes his actions by telling himself that he deserves happiness, but deep down, he knows the pain his actions would cause if discovered. Zoe, on the other hand, is young and impressionable. She is flattered by Casper's attention and drawn to the idea of a future with him. She sees Casper as a successful, mature figure who can provide her with stability and support. Zoe begins to plan for a future with Casper, fantasizing about what their life together would be like. She becomes more invested in the relationship, often daydreaming about their potential future. In the midst of this, Kayla begins to notice changes in her father's behavior. His late nights and frequent absences start to raise questions in her mind. She senses a tension in the house that wasn't there before, and begins to worry about her parents' marriage. They start meeting in secret, and their relationship becomes increasingly intimate. Casper feels guilty about his actions, but he cannot bring himself to stop. Zoe, on the other hand, begins to envision a future together with Casper, and even starts considering the possibility of marrying him. Initially, it starts with innocent encounters, extended conversations after family gatherings, and casual coffee dates under the guise of discussing Kayla's well-being. These moments gradually evolve into more intimate encounters, fueled by the thrill of secrecy and the growing emotional connection between them. One day, Casper and Zoe decide to meet at a hotel, where they can be together without the fear of being caught. They check into a discreet, out-of-the-way place to avoid any chance encounters with people they know. In the privacy of the hotel room, they spend the entire day together, talking, laughing, and deepening their bond. The day is filled with a mix of passion and comfort, as they explore their feelings away from prying eyes. During these moments of intimacy, Casper finds himself conflicted. On one hand, he feels alive and understood in a way he hasn't felt in years. Zoe's youthful energy and understanding nature make him feel rejuvenated. On the other hand, the weight of his betrayal to Laura and Kayla presses heavily on his conscience. He knows that his actions are wrong, yet he is drawn to the solace he finds in Zoe's company. Zoe is equally invested in the relationship. Her initial infatuation with Casper has grown into genuine affection. She dreams of a future where they can be together openly, and she starts to make plans. In her mind, Casper represents stability and maturity, someone who can support and guide her. She becomes increasingly bold in her affection, often talking about the future they could build together. As they leave the hotel and return to their normal lives, Casper's guilt intensifies. The contrast between the passionate, secretive world he shares with Zoe and his everyday life with Laura and Kayla becomes starker. He starts to second-guess his decisions, wondering if the temporary happiness he finds with Zoe is worth the potential destruction of his family. The guilt begins to gnaw at him, affecting his mood and behavior at home. At home, Laura notices the changes in Casper. He is more distracted and often lost in thought. His attempts to be affectionate seem forced, and he becomes irritable when questioned about his late nights and frequent absences. Laura's initial concerns about his well-being gradually shift to suspicion as she senses a growing distance between them. Kayla, too, starts to notice the tension. The once warm and cohesive family dynamic begins to fray. Casper's absences and distracted demeanor make her worry about her parents' relationship. She senses that something is off, but cannot pinpoint the cause. Zoe, meanwhile, becomes more possessive and demanding. She pushes Casper to make a decision about their future, often bringing up the idea of leaving Laura and starting a new life together. Her idealistic vision of their future contrasts sharply with Casper's increasing anxiety. The secret affair, which started as a means of escaping the monotony and loneliness of his marriage, now threatens to unravel the very fabric of Casper's life. His guilt and anxiety grow with each passing day, making it harder to maintain the facade of normalcy at home. The emotional toll begins to manifest in his work as well, where his performance starts to suffer. Casper finds himself caught between two worlds: the passionate, secretive life he shares with Zoe, and the life he has built with Laura and Kayla. The conflict between his desires and his sense of duty creates a constant internal struggle. Kayla begins to suspect that something is wrong. She notices her father's strange behavior and frequent absences for several hours at a time. Her once dependable and predictable father now seems distracted and elusive. The changes in his demeanor, his increased irritability, his lack of interest in family activities, and his constant preoccupation raise red flags for her. Driven by her growing unease, Kayla decides to investigate. She starts paying closer attention to Casper's comings and goings, noting the times he leaves the house and the excuses he provides for his absences. She observes his interactions with Zoe, noticing the subtle glances and secretive conversations. Although she tries to convince herself that she is being paranoid, the evidence mounts, making it increasingly difficult to ignore her suspicions. One evening, while Casper is in the shower, Kayla sneaks a look at his phone. Her heart pounds as she navigates through his messages, and she is stunned to find a series of intimate texts between her father and Zoe. The messages are unmistakable, filled with affection and plans for secret meetings. The realization hits her like a ton of bricks. Her father is having an affair with her best friend. Feeling betrayed and devastated, Kayla's mind races with a mix of emotions. Anger, sadness, and confusion swirl within her as she grapples with the reality of the situation. She recalls moments when Zoe seemed unusually close to her father, and it now all makes sense. The betrayal by both her father and her best friend is almost too much to bear. Determined to uncover the full extent of the affair, Kayla decides to follow them. She starts shadowing Casper's movements whenever he leaves the house, making a note of the places he visits. She discovers that her father and Zoe often meet at a specific hotel, confirming her worst fears. Using her own phone, she takes photos of them entering and leaving the hotel together, gathering evidence of their secret meetings. Kayla also monitors their communication. She installs a tracking app on her father's phone, allowing her to see his messages and calls in real time. The more she uncovers, the deeper her sense of betrayal becomes. She reads their conversations, which are filled with plans for the future and declarations of love. Each message is like a dagger to her heart, reinforcing the severity of the situation. As the days pass, Kayla becomes increasingly obsessed with stopping the affair. She spends hours devising plans, contemplating the best way to confront them. She considers telling her mother, but fears the impact it would have on her family. She contemplates confronting Zoe directly, but doubts whether Zoe would end the affair voluntarily. The weight of the secret becomes a heavy burden, affecting her sleep and concentration. In her desperation, Kayla decides to confront her father first. She plans to gather irrefutable evidence and present it to him, hoping to force him to end the affair. She arranges to meet him at a quiet cafe, away from the prying eyes of their community. When they sit down, Kayla tries to remain calm, but her emotions quickly get the better of her. She accuses Casper of betraying their family, presenting the evidence she has collected. Casper, caught off guard, tries to deny the affair at first, but is forced to admit the truth when confronted with the overwhelming proof. His initial reaction is defensive, but as Kayla's pain becomes evident, his demeanor shifts to one of remorse and guilt. Casper attempts to explain his actions, citing his unhappiness and loneliness in the marriage. However, his justifications fall flat for Kayla, who cannot comprehend how he could betray their family for her best friend. The conversation ends in tears and anger, with Kayla demanding that he end the affair immediately. Despite Casper's promises to end things with Zoe, Kayla remains distrustful. She continues to monitor his actions, doubting his sincerity. She knows that the affair has already caused irreparable damage to their family and her trust in her father. Laura, Casper's wife, senses that something is seriously wrong. She notices the strained silence between Casper and Kayla, the awkwardness that fills their home. Laura observes that Kayla is no longer her cheerful self, and that Casper seems perpetually distracted and guilt-ridden. She asks him directly what is happening, but Casper, burdened by guilt and shame, refuses to divulge the truth. His evasiveness only deepens Laura's suspicions. Kayla, feeling increasingly isolated, withdraws further into herself. She struggles to understand why her father has betrayed her and why he is unwilling to talk to her about it. Her once solid sense of family security is shattered, and she feels as though she has lost not only her best friend, but also her father. The emotional toll begins to affect her daily life, causing her to lose interest in her studies and hobbies. Her academic performance suffers, and she becomes distant from her friends, who notice her change in behavior but are unaware of its cause. Casper, on the other hand, is tormented by guilt. He is acutely aware of the pain he has caused both his daughter and his wife. He knows that his actions have irreparably damaged his family, and he is desperate to find a way to make amends. Laura, concerned for her daughter's well-being, asks Kayla why she has been so distant and upset. Kayla, unable to hold back her emotions any longer, breaks down and reveals the affair between Casper and Zoe. Laura is stunned by the revelation, unable to comprehend the magnitude of the betrayal. The news hits her hard, and she struggles to process the fact that her husband has been unfaithful with their daughter's best friend. Laura's initial reaction is one of shock and disbelief. She feels an overwhelming sense of betrayal and hurt. Her trust in Casper is shattered, and she begins to question the entire foundation of their marriage. The once solid partnership she believed they had now seems like a facade. Laura confronts Casper, demanding an explanation. Casper, cornered and unable to deny the affair any longer, admits to everything. He tries to explain his reasons, citing his feelings of loneliness and the emotional distance that had grown between them. However, his justifications fall flat, and Laura is unable to find any solace in his words. Kayla, overwhelmed by pain and betrayal, decides to take revenge on her father and Zoe. She discovers that Zoe plans to marry her father and that they intend to move into a new home together. Feeling utterly deceived and abandoned, Kayla makes the drastic decision to kill Zoe. Determined to carry out her plan, Kayla begins to follow Zoe closely, learning her routines and searching for the perfect opportunity to strike. She notices that Zoe often takes solitary walks in the local park, a place where she can easily be isolated. Kayla concludes that this will be the ideal setting for the murder. One late afternoon, Kayla spots Zoe heading towards the park. She follows her discreetly, keeping a safe distance to avoid detection. As Zoe walks deeper into the park, the paths become quieter and more secluded. When Zoe reaches a particularly isolated spot, Kayla decides it is time to act. Her heart races as she approaches, the adrenaline masking her fear and hesitation. She confronts Zoe, who is initially startled but then recognizes Kayla. Confusion and a hint of fear flicker across Zoe's face as she tries to understand why Kayla is there. Without giving Zoe a chance to speak, Kayla lunges at her with a knife she had concealed. The attack is swift and brutal, driven by Kayla's pent-up rage and sorrow. Zoe tries to defend herself, but she is overpowered by Kayla's unexpected ferocity. The struggle is brief, and soon Zoe lies lifeless on the ground, her blood staining the earth beneath her. Kayla stands over Zoe's body, panting heavily as the reality of her actions begins to sink in. She feels a wave of conflicting emotions, relief that Zoe is gone, guilt over taking a life, and an unshakable sense of betrayal by her father. The enormity of what she has done starts to weigh on her, but she convinces herself that she did it to protect her family, to save them from further pain and humiliation. In a daze, Kayla wipes the blood from her hands and the knife, attempting to remove any evidence of her crime. She realizes that she needs to leave the scene quickly before anyone discovers what she has done. Kayla hurries away, her mind racing with thoughts of what will happen next. She knows that she cannot hide forever, but for now, she needs to get as far away from the park as possible. Kayla returns home, trying to act normal despite the turmoil inside her. She avoids her father and mother, fearing that they might see through her facade. The next few days are a blur as Kayla anxiously waits to see if anyone will connect her to Zoe's disappearance. The news of Zoe's murder spreads quickly, and the police launch an investigation. but there are no immediate leads. Casper is devastated by Zoe's death. He is consumed by grief and guilt, believing that his affair and the resulting turmoil may have indirectly led to her murder. He becomes even more withdrawn, unable to cope with the loss and the destruction of his family. Laura, too, is shocked and saddened by the news, though she struggles to muster much sympathy given Zoe's role in their family's strife. As the investigation progresses, Kayla's anxiety grows. She knows it is only a matter of time before the truth comes out. The weight of her actions bears down on her, and she finds it increasingly difficult to maintain her composure. Eventually, the police start piecing together the events leading up to Zoe's murder. Witnesses recall seeing Kayla and Zoe together in the park on the day of the murder, and forensic evidence begins to link Kayla to the crime. Realizing that she cannot escape the consequences of her actions, Kayla decides to confess. Initial police reports focused on the discovery of Zoe's body in the park. Forensic experts identified the cause of death as multiple stab wounds, and the scene suggested a violent struggle. Investigators found Kayla's fingerprints on the murder weapon, a knife discovered near the crime scene. Additionally, security footage from nearby areas showed Kayla and Zoe entering the park together on the day of the murder, although it did not capture the actual attack. Witnesses came forward, noting Kayla's erratic behavior in the days leading up to Zoe's death. Some reported seeing her acting suspiciously around the park, while others described her as unusually distant and anxious. The combination of forensic evidence, witness testimonies, and surveillance footage painted a damning picture. Kayla was brought in for questioning. Initially, she was reticent, attempting to maintain her composure despite the mounting evidence against her. However, as the interrogation progressed, Kayla's defenses crumbled. Faced with the overwhelming evidence and the pressure from the police, she eventually confessed to the murder of Zoe. During her confession, Kayla explained her actions in a series of emotional and disjointed statements. She described her feelings of betrayal and the intense pain she experienced upon discovering her father's affair with Zoe. Kayla revealed her plan to kill Zoe, detailing how she had followed her to the park and attacked her in a moment of fury. The confession was filled with remorse and a sense of tragic justification, as Kayla spoke of her desire to protect her family from further harm. The trial included detailed presentations of the evidence, including forensic reports on the murder weapon and the DNA found on it. The prosecution highlighted the premeditated nature of Kayla's crime, pointing out that her actions were driven by personal grievances rather than a spontaneous reaction. Kayla's defense team argued that she had acted out of intense emotional distress. They presented a psychological profile suggesting that Kayla's mental state was severely compromised due to the turmoil within her family. Despite these arguments, the court found that the evidence of premeditation and the brutal nature of the crime outweighed claims of emotional disturbance. On the day of the verdict, Kayla was found guilty of first-degree murder. The judge delivered a stern sentence, reflecting the seriousness of the offense and the profound impact on the victims' families. Kayla was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The severity of the sentence was a stark reminder of the crime's impact on the community and the justice system's commitment to holding individuals accountable for their actions. Kayla was transferred to the ADX Florence Supermax prison in Colorado, known for housing some of the most dangerous and high-profile inmates in the United States. The facility is renowned for its strict security measures and isolation practices, designed to ensure that inmates are kept in secure and controlled environments. Kayla's placement in this prison reflected the gravity of her crime and the perceived need for a highly secure setting to manage her incarceration. The aftermath of the trial left the family in disarray. Casper and Laura struggled to cope with the loss of Zoe and the knowledge that their daughter was responsible for her death. The community, too, grappled with the implications of the case, which served as a tragic example of how personal and familial conflicts can escalate into violence. As Kayla began her life sentence, she faced the harsh reality of her actions and their consequences. The weight of her crime and the isolation of her prison environment provided a somber conclusion to the tragic events that had unfolded. The case remained a poignant reminder of the devastating effects of betrayal and emotional turmoil, and the relentless pursuit of justice for those affected by such profound tragedies. Riverside, California. The city of just under 15,000 people was known for its quiet streets and close-knit neighborhoods. Families had lived here for generations, and people were proud to know their neighbors. The Marshall family, consisting of Elizabeth Marshall and her daughter Madeline, lived in Riverside for a long time. Madeline Marshall is a 20-year-old woman living in Riverside, California. Working as a librarian at the Riverside Public Library, Madeline is known for her kind and gentle nature. She is a quiet, introspective person who values simplicity and stability in life. Growing up without a father figure, Madeline formed a deep bond with her mother, Elizabeth, who has been her primary source of support and guidance throughout her life. Despite her calm exterior, Madeline has always harbored a desire for something more, a yearning for true love, the kind she has read about in books, but never experienced herself. Madeline's days are largely routine. She enjoys the peaceful atmosphere of the library, where she spends her time among books, organizing shelves, and helping the occasional patron find what they need. Her life in Riverside is uneventful, and although she is content, she often dreams of what it would be like to experience the excitement and passion of a romantic relationship. However, Madeline's nature is such that she is not one to actively seek out these experiences. Madeline's relationship with her mother is central to her life. Elizabeth Marshall is not just her mother, but also her confidant and mentor. The two women share a close bond, built on mutual respect and affection. Elizabeth's strength and independence have always been a source of inspiration for Madeline. Having been raised by Elizabeth alone, Madeline has grown up with a deep appreciation for her mother's resilience and determination. However, despite their closeness, there are parts of Elizabeth's past that Madeline knows little about, particularly the details surrounding her parents' divorce. Elizabeth Marshall is a 51-year-old woman who has lived in Riverside for most of her life. She is a well-respected teacher at the local high school, where she has worked for over 2 decades. Known for her dedication to her students and her firm but fair approach to teaching, Elizabeth has become a beloved figure in the community. Her reputation as a strong, independent woman has been earned through years of hard work and personal sacrifice. Elizabeth's life has been shaped by her experience as a single mother. She divorced her husband, Jonathan Kingston, when Madeline was still a baby. The marriage was short-lived, marked by increasing tension and conflict. Jonathan's controlling behavior and obsessive jealousy made the relationship unbearable for Elizabeth, and she eventually made the difficult decision to leave him, taking Madeline with her. Jonathan Kingston, now 46 years old, is a man who has recently returned to Riverside under a new identity. Once a handsome and charismatic figure, Jonathan's outward appearance belies the deeply troubled nature that lies beneath. Years ago, he was married to Elizabeth, but their marriage ended in a bitter and acrimonious divorce. Jonathan's obsessive nature and controlling behavior drove Elizabeth away, leaving him with a deep sense of betrayal and anger. For years, Jonathan harbored a desire for revenge, feeling that Elizabeth had ruined his life by leaving him. He blamed her for his failures and for the loneliness that followed their separation. Over time, this resentment festered, and he began to form a plan to make Elizabeth pay for what he perceived as her betrayal. Jonathan decided that the best way to hurt Elizabeth would be to target the one person she loved most, her daughter, Madeline. When Jonathan learned that Elizabeth and Madeline were still living in Riverside, he saw an opportunity to put his plan into action. Moving into the house next door to the Marshalls under the guise of starting a new life, Jonathan set about ingratiating himself into the community. His charm and friendly demeanor made it easy for him to win people over, including Madeline. To her, Jonathan appeared as the perfect neighbor, kind, considerate, and always willing to lend a hand. Jonathan's motivations are driven by a twisted sense of justice. He sees his actions as a way of reclaiming control over his life and exacting retribution on Elizabeth for the pain she caused him. He believes that by winning over Madeline, he can not only hurt Elizabeth but also prove to himself that he still has power and influence. Madeline first met Jonathan Kingston. He had just moved into the house next door, a modest 2-story home that had been vacant for several months. As Madeline was returning from her shift at the Riverside Public Library, she noticed a moving truck parked outside and a man unloading boxes. Curious, and always eager to make new neighbors feel welcome, Madeline approached to introduce herself. Jonathan, upon seeing her, flashed a warm smile that immediately put her at ease. "Hi there," Madeline said, extending her hand. "I'm Madeline Marshall. I live next door." "Jonathan Kingston," he replied, taking her hand in his. "Nice to meet you, Madeline. It looks like we'll be seeing a lot of each other." From that moment, Jonathan began weaving his way into Madeline's life. Their initial encounters were casual, friendly conversations over the fence, waves exchanged as they passed each other in the driveway. Jonathan was always polite, always attentive, and he quickly picked up on the small details of Madeline's life. He learned that she worked at the library, that she loved to read, and that she spent most of her free time with her mother, Elizabeth. Within a few weeks, their interactions became more frequent. Jonathan would invite Madeline over for coffee, offer to help with small tasks around her house, or suggest they go for a walk in the neighborhood. Each time, he was careful to show just the right amount of interest. Never too much to seem overwhelming, but enough to make Madeline feel special. He complimented her intelligence, praised her kindness, and made her feel appreciated in a way that no one had before. Madeline, who had always longed for a connection like this, found herself drawn to Jonathan more and more. He seemed to embody everything she had ever wanted in a partner. He was charming, considerate, and genuinely interested in her. For the first time, she began to feel the stirrings of a deep, emotional connection. Jonathan, with his easygoing manner and engaging conversation, made her feel like the most important person in the world. It wasn't long before Madeline realized that she was falling for him. As their relationship blossomed, Jonathan continued to play his part perfectly. He was always careful to mirror Madeline's feelings, to respond to her needs before she even voiced them. When she expressed interest in a particular book, he would surprise her with a copy the next day. When she mentioned that she enjoyed hiking, he suggested they explore some local trails together. Each gesture, each act of kindness, was calculated to deepen her attachment to him. To Madeline, their relationship felt like a dream come true. Here was a man who seemed to understand her completely, who valued her for who she was, and who wanted to share his life with her. She couldn't believe her luck. After years of waiting, she had finally found someone who made her feel truly loved. She confided in her mother about her growing feelings, speaking of Jonathan, with a sense of excitement and optimism that Elizabeth hadn't seen in her daughter before. Jonathan's satisfaction grew as he watched Madeline become more and more attached to him. He knew that each day brought him closer to his ultimate goal: revenge against Elizabeth. The thought of the pain he would soon inflict on her gave him a perverse sense of pleasure. He reveled in the knowledge that Elizabeth, who had once escaped his control, would soon suffer in a way she could never have imagined. And the best part was, she had no idea that the trap was already closing around her. As their relationship progressed, Jonathan began to subtly distance Madeline from Elizabeth. He would suggest that they spend time alone together, away from her mother, or make comments that planted seeds of doubt about Elizabeth's intentions. Madeline, blinded by her feelings for Jonathan, didn't see the manipulation for what it was. She began to question her mother's opinions, to see Elizabeth's concerns as overprotective rather than legitimate. Jonathan's plan was unfolding exactly as he had intended. Elizabeth began to notice subtle changes in Madeline's behavior. Her daughter, once open and communicative, had become more withdrawn, secretive even. Madeline spent increasingly more time with Jonathan, often leaving Elizabeth alone in their once lively home. At first, Elizabeth dismissed these changes as a natural part of Madeline growing up and finding love. But as the weeks passed, her unease grew into something more, an instinctual feeling that something was terribly wrong. Elizabeth found herself questioning Jonathan's place in their lives. He had integrated himself so seamlessly, too seamlessly, into their world. His charm, which had initially seemed genuine, now struck her as calculated, even manipulative. There were moments when Elizabeth felt she was being watched. It was during these moments of quiet reflection that a horrifying thought began to take root in her mind. Jonathan's familiarity, his age, the way he carried himself. Everything pointed to a resemblance she had tried hard to forget. One evening, as she sat alone in the living room, Elizabeth's mind wandered back to her past. She had long since buried the memories of her first marriage, but now they resurfaced with alarming clarity. The way Jonathan moved, his tone of voice, the unsettling way he could make a person feel both seen and manipulated, it all clicked. Her heart pounded in her chest as she allowed herself to entertain the possibility that this man, this Jonathan Kingston, could be none other than her ex-husband. Driven by a mix of fear and desperation, Elizabeth began to piece together the timeline of Jonathan's appearance in their lives. She searched through old photo albums, legal documents, anything that might confirm her growing suspicion. As she uncovered old photographs and court papers from her divorce, Elizabeth felt the blood drain from her face. There was no mistaking it. Jonathan Kingston was indeed the man she had once been married to, the man she had escaped from years ago to protect herself and her daughter. The next day, Elizabeth steeled herself and walked over to Jonathan's house. She knocked on the door, her heart racing as she waited for him to answer. When Jonathan opened the door, his expression shifted from pleasant surprise to a cold, calculating look. He seemed to know, without a word being spoken, why she was there. "We need to talk," Elizabeth said, her voice firm, though she could feel it trembling slightly. Jonathan stepped aside, allowing her to enter. The house, which had always struck her as too perfectly arranged, now felt like a trap, a place designed to ensnare and control. She refused his offer of a seat, choosing instead to remain standing, arms crossed defensively. "You need to leave," Elizabeth began, cutting straight to the point. "I know who you are, Jonathan. I know what you're trying to do, and I won't let you destroy my daughter's life the way you tried to destroy mine." Jonathan's face twisted into a smirk, a look that sent a chill down Elizabeth's spine. He didn't even attempt to deny it. Instead, he leaned back against the wall, crossing his arms casually, as if they were discussing the weather. "Ah, Elizabeth," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I was wondering how long it would take you to figure it out. I suppose I should congratulate you on your detective work, but you're too late." Elizabeth's stomach turned at his words. She had expected him to deny it, to try and worm his way out of the accusation, but his blatant admission caught her off guard. "What do you want from us?" she demanded, though she already feared the answer. Jonathan's expression hardened, his smirk fading into something more menacing. "I want you to feel the same pain you caused me. You took everything from me, Elizabeth. You walked away and left me to pick up the pieces of a life that you shattered. So, I decided to return the favor." Elizabeth felt her knees weaken, but she refused to show fear. "Madeline has nothing to do with this. If you have a problem with me, leave her out of it." "On the contrary," Jonathan replied, his voice cold and unfeeling. "Madeline has everything to do with this. She's your daughter, Elizabeth, the one person you love more than anything else in this world. And I've made her fall in love with me. She trusts me, cares for me, and when the time is right, she'll turn against you, just like you turned against me." Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears, but she fought to keep them from falling. "You can't do this, Jonathan. You're playing with her life, her emotions. She doesn't deserve this." "Neither did I," Jonathan shot back, his voice rising with anger. "But you didn't care about that, did you? You just left, without a second thought. Now, you'll see what it feels like to lose everything, to have the person you love most ripped away from you." At that moment, the door creaked open, and both Elizabeth and Jonathan turned to see Madeline standing in the doorway, her face pale and her eyes wide with shock. "Mom, what's going on?" Madeline's voice trembled as she looked from her mother to Jonathan, confusion and fear evident on her face. Elizabeth's heart broke at the sight of her daughter, caught in the middle of a situation she couldn't possibly understand. "Madeline, this man, he's not who you think he is," Elizabeth began, her voice shaking. "He's my ex-husband. He's been manipulating you to get back at me." Madeline's eyes widened in disbelief. "What? No, that's not true. Jonathan, tell her." Jonathan remained silent for a moment, his eyes narrowing as he considered his next move. Then, he spoke, his voice calm and measured. "Madeline, your mother is confused. She's just upset because you and I have something special, something she never had with me." Madeline's gaze darted between her mother and Jonathan, her mind racing. "Mom, why are you doing this? Are you jealous? Is that what this is about?" Elizabeth felt a surge of panic. "No, Madeline, it's not like that. I'm trying to protect you. Please, you have to believe me." But Madeline, overwhelmed and confused, shook her head. I can't. I don't understand. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence, with Elizabeth desperately trying to reach her daughter, and Jonathan watching with a cold, satisfied expression. Madeline stood frozen, caught between the two people she loved most, not knowing who to believe. Jonathan, sensing that the moment was slipping away from him, stepped forward and gently took Madeline's hand. Madeline, let's leave. Let's get out of here and talk about this somewhere else. Madeline hesitated, glancing at her mother, whose eyes were pleading with her to stay. But the emotional turmoil was too much, and in her confusion, she allowed Jonathan to lead her away. Elizabeth watched helplessly as her daughter walked out of the door, hand in hand with the man who was determined to destroy their lives. The tension between Madeline, Elizabeth, and Jonathan had reached a breaking point. Madeline was torn between her love for Jonathan and her trust in her mother. Jonathan, sensing that his carefully crafted plan was starting to unravel, became increasingly erratic and controlling. Elizabeth, now fully aware of who Jonathan truly was, feared for her daughter's safety. One stormy night, Elizabeth confronted Jonathan in her home. She demanded that he leave and never come back, but Jonathan, fueled by years of bitterness, refused. His charm had vanished, replaced by a cold, menacing anger. Madeline, who was with Jonathan, watched in growing horror as the man she thought she loved revealed his true nature. Madeline, you need to understand, Elizabeth pleaded, her voice trembling with urgency. He's been lying to you, manipulating you to get back at me. He's dangerous, Jonathan sneered, his eyes filled with venom. You always knew how to play the victim, Elizabeth, he said coldly. But this time, no one's buying it. The argument quickly escalated. Jonathan's grip on his emotions slipped, and he suddenly lashed out, grabbing Elizabeth by the arm with a violent intensity. You destroyed my life, Elizabeth, he hissed. Now, it's your turn to suffer. Madeline, witnessing the brutality of the man she thought she loved, was paralyzed by fear and confusion. The reality of the situation crashed down on her. Her mother had been right all along. Jonathan was not the man she believed him to be. He was a threat, a danger to both her and Elizabeth. Let her go, Madeline cried out, her voice breaking with panic. But Jonathan was too consumed by his rage to listen. In that moment, Madeline's fear for her mother's safety overpowered everything else. Acting on pure instinct, she grabbed a heavy vase from a nearby table and struck Jonathan on the head with all her strength. The impact was immediate. Jonathan staggered, releasing Elizabeth as he clutched his head, his eyes wide with shock. He tried to steady himself, but his body gave out, and he collapsed to the floor, blood pooling around him. The room fell into an eerie silence, broken only by the sound of the storm outside. Madeline stood frozen, the vase still in her trembling hands, unable to comprehend what she had just done. Jonathan lay motionless, his eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. He was dead. Elizabeth rushed to her daughter's side, pulling her into a tight embrace. Madeline, oh my God, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. But Madeline couldn't respond. She was in shock, her mind struggling to process the fact that she had just killed the man she thought she loved. The weight of her actions began to sink in, and Madeline felt a wave of nausea. She had killed Jonathan to protect her mother, but the realization was too much to bear. She collapsed into Elizabeth's arms, sobbing uncontrollably. Elizabeth held her daughter tightly, her heart breaking for the pain and trauma Madeline was now facing. She knew that their lives would never be the same after this night. Jonathan's death would haunt them both, a dark shadow over their future. The aftermath of Jonathan Kingston's death was chaotic and overwhelming. The police arrived quickly, responding to Elizabeth's frantic 911 call. The scene was grim. Jonathan's lifeless body lay on the living room floor, blood seeping into the carpet, while Madeline sat nearby, pale and trembling, still in shock from what had transpired. Madeline was taken into custody and charged with Jonathan's murder. The news spread rapidly, and soon the town of Riverside was buzzing with speculation and gossip. The once quiet Marshall family found themselves at the center of a media frenzy, with reporters and curious onlookers gathering outside their home, hungry for details about the case. Witnesses, including Elizabeth herself, recounted Jonathan's increasingly erratic behavior and the threats he had made in the days leading up to his death. The evidence painted a clear picture of a man driven by obsession and malice, intent on destroying the lives of those he once claimed to love. Madeline's defense attorney argued that she had acted in self-defense, driven by fear for her mother's life. The prosecution, however, sought to portray the incident as an intentional act of violence. The trial was highly publicized, drawing intense scrutiny and dividing public opinion. Some sympathized with Madeline, viewing her as a victim of Jonathan's manipulations, while others believed she had gone too far in her actions. As the trial progressed, the courtroom became a battleground of conflicting testimonies and emotions. Elizabeth took the stand, her voice steady but filled with sorrow as she recounted the events leading up to that fateful night. She described the terror she felt when Jonathan grabbed her, and how Madeline had intervened in a desperate attempt to save her. The jury listened intently as experts testified about the psychological toll Jonathan's behavior had taken on both Madeline and Elizabeth. They highlighted the years of emotional abuse and manipulation that had driven Jonathan to the brink, as well as the split-second decision Madeline made in a moment of extreme fear. In the end, the jury was swayed by the evidence of Jonathan's abusive nature and the clear threat he posed to Elizabeth's life. After days of deliberation, they returned a verdict of not guilty. Madeline was acquitted, her actions deemed a necessary response to the imminent danger posed by Jonathan. The verdict was met with mixed reactions. While many in Riverside breathed a sigh of relief, believing that justice had been served, others remained skeptical, questioning whether the full truth had been revealed. The media coverage intensified, with pundits and commentators dissecting every detail of the case, further deepening the public divide. Despite her acquittal, Madeline was left to grapple with the emotional scars of that night. The trauma of taking a life, even in self-defense, weighed heavily on her. Elizabeth, too, struggled with guilt and regret, knowing that her past with Jonathan had ultimately led to the tragedy. The once close bond between mother and daughter was strained, their relationship forever altered by the events that had transpired.